The morning of March 4th, 1944, 26,000 feet above Berlin, the temperature is 40 degrees below zero. Captain Donald Blakesley pushes his throttle forward, feeling the Packard Merlin engine respond with a mechanical growl that vibrates through his entire airframe. His target, a Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6, is running, full throttle, desperate. The German pilot knows his aircraft's capabilities. Top speed, 385 miles per hour in level flight, fast enough to escape most Allied fighters, fast enough to survive. But as Blakesley's P-51 Mustang closes the distance, the Messerschmitt pilot glances back and sees something impossible. The American fighter is gaining, not slowly, not gradually, but steadily, inevitably, like a predator that has tasted blood. Blakesley's airspeed indicator climbs past 420, past 440. His wings shudder with the strain, but the engine doesn't falter. Don't overheat, don't seize. At 460 miles per hour, he's within gun range. 650 caliber machine guns light up the frozen sky. The Messerschmitt disintegrates. What the German pilot never knew, what Blakesley himself didn't fully understand, was that his survival depended on a crime. Inside that Merlin engine, 16 exhaust valves made from an illegal alloy were operating at temperatures exceeding 1600 degrees Fahrenheit. Those valves contained molybdenum, a strategic metal that the United States government had explicitly forbidden for use in aircraft engines. The man who created them, a 58-year-old metallurgist named Zay Jeffries, had broken federal law to give American fighters an advantage that would help win the air war over Europe. This is the story of how one scientist's defiance of his own government created the most lethal fighter aircraft of World War II. It's the story of bureaucracy versus battlefield necessity, of regulations versus reality, of a quiet act of rebellion that changed the course of history. And it begins not in the skies over Germany, but in the offices and laboratories of Cleveland, Ohio, where a man with wire-rimmed glasses and a stubborn streak decided that sometimes winning a war requires breaking the rules. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. To understand why Jeffries had to break the law, we need to understand the problem he was trying to solve. And that problem, in early 1943, seemed almost insurmountable. The United States had a fighter aircraft that was, on paper, magnificent. The North American P-51 Mustang possessed a sleek, laminar flow wing design that reduced drag to unprecedented levels. Its fuselage was aerodynamically refined through hundreds of hours of wind tunnel testing. Its range, thanks to carefully designed internal fuel tanks and the addition of external drop tanks, exceeded any fighter aircraft in production. The Mustang could fly from England to Berlin and back, something no other Allied fighter could accomplish. But there was a catastrophic flaw. The original Mustang, designated the P-51A, was powered by an Allison V1710 engine. This was a capable power plant at low altitude, generating over 1,000 horsepower for ground attack and tactical reconnaissance missions. But above 15,000 feet, the Allison simply couldn't perform. The engine lacked an efficient supercharger system for high-altitude operations. In the thin air of the stratosphere, where German fighters dominated, the Mustang's performance collapsed. Pilots reported sluggish acceleration, poor climb rates, and an alarming tendency to lose speed during combat maneuvers. This wasn't a minor inconvenience. By early 1943, the strategic bombing campaign against Germany was failing. American B-17 and B-24 bombers were flying deep into German airspace, targeting industrial facilities, oil refineries, and aircraft production plants. But without fighter escorts capable of staying with them throughout the mission, the bombers were being slaughtered. German fighters would wait until the short-range P-47 Thunderbolts reached their fuel limits and turned back, then swarm the unprotected bomber formations. The statistics were devastating. On October 14, 1943, a day that would become known as Black Thursday, the 8th Air Force sent 291 B-17s to attack ball-bearing factories in Schweinfurt, Germany. 60 bombers were shot down. Another 17 were damaged beyond repair. 600 crewmen were dead or missing. The loss rate was unsustainable. At that pace, bomber crews had virtually no statistical chance of surviving their required 25-mission tour of duty. The solution seemed obvious: escort the bombers all the way to the target and back. But no Allied fighter had the range. The P-47 Thunderbolt, even with external fuel tanks, could barely reach the German border before having to turn back. The British Spitfire, magnificent in defensive operations, had even shorter legs. The twin-engine P-38 Lightning had range but lacked speed and maneuverability at high altitude. Then came a suggestion that would change everything. What if the Mustang's Allison engine was replaced with a British Rolls-Royce Merlin? The Merlin engine was already legendary. It had powered Spitfires through the Battle of Britain in 1940. It propelled Halifax and Lancaster bombers across the night skies of occupied Europe. And critically, it possessed a two-stage, two-speed supercharger system that maintained power output at altitude. The Merlin thrived where the Allison suffocated. In April of 1942, Rolls-Royce test pilot Ronald Harker flew a Mustang fitted with a Merlin 61 engine at the Royal Aircraft Establishment in Farnborough, England. His report was almost breathless. "The aircraft was transformed," he wrote. "It handled beautifully at altitude, and the increase in performance was dramatic." He estimated the Merlin-powered Mustang would reach speeds exceeding 420 miles per hour at 25,000 feet faster than any German fighter in production. The U.S. Army Air Forces authorized immediate development. By October of 1942, contracts were signed for Packard Motor Company in Detroit to manufacture Merlins under license. The British would provide the technical specifications, the tooling requirements, and engineering support. Packard would adapt the engine for American production methods and install it in the Mustang airframe. The resulting aircraft, designated the P-51B, would enter production in the spring of 1943. But there was a problem, a materials problem, a problem that would require someone to commit a federal crime to solve. The Merlin engine, when operated at combat power settings for extended periods, generated exhaust gas temperatures exceeding 1600 degrees Fahrenheit. These gases flowed through exhaust valves, steel components that opened and closed thousands of times per minute, enduring not just extreme heat but also tremendous mechanical stress and corrosive combustion byproducts. In a Spitfire, operating defensive sorties over England, valve life of 50 to 75 hours was acceptable. Maintenance crews could swap valves regularly. Aircraft could be rotated through maintenance schedules. The operational tempo allowed for frequent engine overhauls. But the Mustang was being designed for something unprecedented. Long-range bomber escort missions would last 7, 8, sometimes 9 hours. Pilots would run their engines at high power settings for extended periods, climbing to altitude, engaging enemy fighters, pursuing targets, fleeing combat, all at 25,000 feet where the thin air forced the engine to work harder. There was no margin for valve failure 400 miles inside Germany, surrounded by enemy fighters, with fuel running low, and standard steel valves couldn't survive. The metallurgy was straightforward. Steel, even high-grade alloy steel, begins to lose hardness and strength at temperatures above 1400 degrees Fahrenheit. At 1600 degrees, subjected to repeated thermal cycling and mechanical stress, steel valves would creep, gradually deforming under load. They would experience valve seat recession, where the valve face erodes and no longer seals properly. They would suffer from hot corrosion, where sulfur and other combustion byproducts attack the metal's grain structure. Within 50 hours of operation, they would fail. Valve failure in a Merlin engine was catastrophic. A failed exhaust valve would allow combustion gases to escape into the valve train, causing further damage. Engine power would drop. Cylinder head temperatures would spike. If not caught immediately, the engine would destroy itself. Over Germany, engine failure meant bailing out if you were lucky. More likely, it meant a forced landing in enemy territory, capture, or death. The British had experimented with various valve materials. Tungsten carbide coatings provided some improvement. Chromium nickel steel alloys extended valve life marginally, but nothing provided the durability required for the mission profile the Americans were demanding. Nothing in the approved materials specifications could survive 8-hour missions, week after week, with minimal maintenance. Nothing except molybdenum. Molybdenum is element 42 on the periodic table. It's a silvery white metal with a melting point of 4,753 degrees Fahrenheit, one of the highest melting points of any pure element. When alloyed with steel in precise ratios, typically between 5 and 10%, it creates a material that maintains hardness at extreme temperatures. Molybdenum steel resists thermal deformation. It withstands oxidation and hot corrosion. It retains strength under repeated thermal cycling. For exhaust valves operating at 1600 degrees, thousands of times per minute, hour after hour, molybdenum steel was the perfect solution. There was just one problem. In 1942, the United States government made molybdenum steel alloys illegal for aircraft engine components. The regulation came from the War Production Board, the federal agency responsible for allocating strategic materials during the war. The logic seemed reasonable. Molybdenum was rare. Domestic production came primarily from a handful of mines in Colorado and New Mexico. Imports, largely from Chile, were vulnerable to submarine attack. Every pound of molybdenum had to be carefully rationed, and the War Production Board had priorities. Molybdenum was essential for armor plate. Sherman tanks needed molybdenum steel armor to resist German anti-tank rounds. Naval vessels required molybdenum steel for deck armor and turret protection. Molybdenum was critical for artillery barrels, which experienced tremendous thermal stress from repeated firing. Gun barrels made without molybdenum wore out quickly, reducing accuracy and requiring frequent replacement. Compared to tanks and artillery, fighter aircraft exhaust valves seemed like a luxury. The War Production Board allocated molybdenum strictly: armor first, artillery second, tooling and dies third, everything else fourth if anything remained. Aircraft engines fell into the everything else category. Engineers were instructed to use approved substitute materials: chromium nickel steel, tungsten carbide coatings, anything except molybdenum. It didn't matter that substitute materials didn't work. It didn't matter that valve failures were grounding aircraft and killing pilots. The regulations were clear. Molybdenum was too strategic, too scarce to waste on fighter plane components. This was the situation Zay Jeffries faced in early 1943. And Zay Jeffries was not the kind of man who accepted bureaucratic nonsense when lives were at stake. Born in 1885 in Pataskala, Ohio, Jeffries had spent his entire adult life studying metals. He earned his Ph.D. in metallurgical engineering from the Case School of Applied Science in 1911, then joined General Electric's research laboratory in Schenectady, New York. For 3 decades, he worked on high-temperature alloys, focusing specifically on materials that could withstand extreme thermal stress. He held dozens of patents. He published extensively in metallurgical journals. By 1943, at age 58, he was vice president of General Electric's Chemical and Metallurgical Division, and was widely regarded as one of America's leading experts on superalloys. Jeffries knew molybdenum. He had worked with molybdenum steel alloys since the 1920s. He understood the precise ratios needed for different applications. He knew how molybdenum atoms fit into the crystal lattice of steel, preventing dislocation movement at high temperatures. He knew, with absolute certainty, that molybdenum steel valves would solve the Merlin engine's durability problem. So he applied for War Production Board approval to use molybdenum in exhaust valve manufacturing. He submitted technical papers demonstrating the metallurgical necessity. He provided calculations showing that standard steel couldn't survive the mission profiles. He argued that without reliable high-altitude engines, the strategic bombing campaign would fail, the air war would be lost, and American lives would be wasted. The War Production Board denied his request. The reason? Insufficient supply. Molybdenum was allocated to higher priorities. Aircraft engine components would have to make do with approved alternatives. Jeffries tried again. He appealed to higher authorities. He contacted military procurement officers, explaining the operational consequences of valve failures. He wrote to Army Air Forces headquarters, detailing the strategic implications. He made the case that a few tons of molybdenum in exhaust valves could enable thousands of bombing missions, which could destroy hundreds of German factories, which could cripple the Nazi war machine. The response was always the same: denied. Regulations exist for a reason. Priorities must be maintained. Use approved materials. Jeffries faced a decision that would define the rest of his life. He could comply with federal law, watch Mustang engines fail over Germany, and know that pilots were dying because bureaucrats in Washington couldn't see past their allocation spreadsheets. Or he could break the law. He chose rebellion. Working through General Electric's Carbaloy division in Detroit, Jeffries began a quiet campaign of material substitution and falsified documentation. He coordinated with sympathetic procurement officers at Packard Motor Company who understood the operational reality, even if they couldn't officially acknowledge it. Together, they created a shadow supply chain for molybdenum steel exhaust valves. The scheme was straightforward but required careful coordination. Jeffries would request molybdenum for approved projects, tooling, dies, experimental turbine blades. The requisition forms would be legitimate. The molybdenum would be delivered to General Electric facilities in Detroit. Then, instead of using all the material for approved purposes, Jeffries would divert a portion to exhaust valve production. The valves would be manufactured at the Carbaloy facility using a proprietary alloy Jeffries had developed called Stellite 21. Stellite 21 was a carefully engineered superalloy, approximately 8% molybdenum, 27% chromium, 5% tungsten, 2.5% carbon, with the balance being iron and trace elements. The exact composition was optimized for exhaust valve applications hard enough to resist wear, tough enough to withstand mechanical shock, stable enough to maintain properties through thousands of thermal cycles. The finished valves were shipped to Packard with falsified materials certificates. The documentation listed them as tungsten chromium steel, an approved material. The actual composition was never disclosed. Packard inspectors, if they noticed the discrepancy, chose not to report it. They knew the valves worked. They knew the alternative was unacceptable. Sometimes, battlefield necessity overrides bureaucratic compliance. By late 1943, every Packard Merlin engine rolling off the Detroit production line contained 16 exhaust valves made from Jeffrey's illegal molybdenum steel alloy. Thousands of engines, hundreds of thousands of valves, all technically contraband, all essential to winning the war. The first P-51B Mustangs entered operational service with the 8th Air Force in England in November of 1943. The 3054th Fighter Group, based at Boxted, received the initial delivery. Pilots who had flown P-47s were skeptical. The Mustang looked sleek, almost fragile compared to the brutish Thunderbolt. But when they climbed into the cockpit and felt the Merlin engine's response, skepticism turned to enthusiasm. The performance was extraordinary. The P-51B could reach 25,000 feet in under 10 minutes. It could sustain 420 miles per hour in level flight at altitude. With external drop tanks, it had a combat radius exceeding 650 miles, enough to escort bombers to Berlin and back, and critically, the engines were reliable. Pilots who had grown accustomed to watching cylinder head temperature gauges creep toward the red zone, who had experienced rough running and power loss at altitude, who had nursed damaged engines back to England, suddenly found themselves flying aircraft that simply worked, mission after mission. Maintenance crews noticed immediately. Exhaust valve inspections, previously required every 50 hours, were being extended. Valves that should have shown wear after 75 hours were still within tolerance at 150 hours. Some valves remained serviceable past 300 hours, a six-fold improvement over standard materials. Engine reliability rates improved dramatically. Aircraft availability increased. Squadrons that had struggled to put 12 fighters in the air could now launch 16, 18, 20 aircraft per mission. But the true test would come in the skies over Germany, when the Mustang finally fulfilled its destiny as a long-range escort fighter. The morning of December 13, 1943, Major James Howard, commanding officer of the 354th Fighter Squadron, leads his Mustangs toward Kiel, Germany, escorting B-17s attacking U-boat construction facilities. This is one of the first deep penetration missions for the P-51B, a test of whether the aircraft can actually do what it was designed to do. At 24,000 feet, approaching the target, German fighters appear, Messerschmitt Bf-109Gs and Focke-Wulf 190, as scrambling from airfields across northern Germany. Howard counts over 30 enemy aircraft positioning for attack runs on the bomber formation. His squadron has only 16 Mustangs. The tactical situation is desperate, but Howard has something the German pilots don't expect. He has speed, he has altitude performance, and he has engines that don't fail under sustained combat power. The dogfight that follows lasts 40 minutes. Howard engages enemy fighters continuously, expending all his ammunition. He damages multiple aircraft. He disrupts attack runs, forcing German pilots to break off before reaching the bombers. And his Mustang never falters. The engine maintains full power through violent maneuvers, through rapid climbs and dives, through extended high-power settings that should have overheated the exhaust system. The valves, forged from Jeffrey's illegal alloy, endure thermal stress that would have destroyed standard steel components. Howard survives. His squadron survives. More importantly, the bombers survive. Of the B-17s they were escorting, not one was lost to fighter attack. For this action, James Howard would receive the Medal of Honor, the only fighter pilot in the European theatre to earn America's highest military decoration. But the real miracle wasn't Howard's skill or courage, though both were exceptional. The real miracle was that his engine didn't fail him when he needed it most. Word spread quickly through the 8th Air Force. The Mustang worked, not just in theory, not just in test flights, but in combat. Pilots who had viewed long-range escort missions as suicide assignments began requesting transfers to Mustang squadrons. Bomber crews, who had watched fighters turn back at the German border mission after mission, now had escorts that stayed with them all the way to the target and back. By January of 1944, P-51B and P-51D Mustangs were equipping additional fighter groups. The 4th Fighter Group transitioned from P-47s to Mustangs. The 357th Fighter Group arrived from the United States fully equipped with Mustangs. The 20th, 55th, and 361st Fighter Groups followed. By February, the 8th Air Force possessed over 250 operational Mustangs, with production accelerating. And inside every one of those aircraft, inside every Packard Merlin engine, were exhaust valves that violated federal regulations. Valves that Zay Jeffries had created in defiance of the War Production Board. Valves that were, by the strict letter of the law, illegal. No one in Washington seemed to notice. Or if they noticed, they chose not to ask questions. The Mustangs were performing miracles. The strategic bombing campaign was finally sustainable. Why investigate? The answer to why the Mustangs were suddenly so reliable remained buried in technical specifications and materials certificates that nobody bothered to audit. After all, the air war was turning. Why question success? But success, as it turned out, would come with a reckoning, and that reckoning would reveal just how far Jeffries had gone to defy his own government. The transformation of the air war over Europe in early 1944 was nothing short of revolutionary. For 2 years, American bomber crews had flown into German airspace knowing that once their escorts turned back, they were alone. The Luftwaffe would appear in formations of 50, 70, sometimes over 100 fighters, attacking in coordinated waves. Bomber gunners would fire desperately at approaching enemy aircraft while pilots held formation, knowing that breaking formation meant certain death. The loss rates were catastrophic. Young men, 19, 20, 21 years old, would complete 1 mission, maybe 2, and never return. But by February of 1944, something had changed. The Mustangs were everywhere. German fighter pilots who had grown accustomed to attacking undefended bomber formations now found themselves engaged by American fighters deep inside the Reich. And these weren't short, desperate skirmishes where the Allied fighters had to break off after a few minutes to preserve fuel for the return journey. These were sustained engagements where the Mustangs had the endurance to hunt, to pursue, to press the attack until the enemy was destroyed or fled. The psychological impact was profound. Luftwaffe pilots, who had dominated European skies since 1939, who had learned to respect the P-47 Thunderbolt's ruggedness and the Spitfire's maneuverability but knew both had limited range, now faced an aircraft that combined speed, range, and reliability into a weapon they couldn't escape. The Mustang could outrun them in level flight. It could outdive them. It could turn with them at high altitude. And it could do all of this 400 miles from the nearest Allied airfield. German fighter pilot Hans Philipp, a decorated ace with over 200 victories, wrote in his diary in early 1944, "The Americans have produced a fighter that flies as fast as our best, fights as well as our best, and can fly to Berlin and back. We have nothing to match it." Philipp would be shot down and killed by a P-47 Thunderbolt on October 8, 1943, But his assessment of American fighter development proved prophetic. The true test of the Mustang's capabilities came during Operation Argument, a coordinated series of massive bombing raids that would become known as Big Week, February 20th through 25th, 1944. 6 days that would fundamentally alter the balance of air power over Europe. The strategic objective was clear: destroy German aircraft production at its source. The Luftwaffe was still producing fighters at an impressive rate, over 1,000 Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs per month. But production facilities were concentrated in a handful of major industrial complexes: Messerschmitt plants in Regensburg and Augsburg, Focke-Wulf facilities in Bremen, component manufacturers scattered across central Germany. If the Allies could destroy these factories, they could cripple German fighter production for months, potentially years. The problem was location. These targets lay deep in German territory: Leipzig, Regensburg, Augsburg, Stuttgart, Schweinfurt, all beyond the range of previous escort fighters. The Luftwaffe had positioned them strategically, knowing Allied bombers would be vulnerable during the final approach and egress. Previous attempts to bomb these facilities had resulted in catastrophic losses. The Schweinfurt raid in October 1943 had cost 60 bombers in a single day. But now the Americans had Mustangs, and the Mustangs had Jeffries valves. The first day of Big Week, February 20th, saw over 1,000 American heavy bombers launch from bases across England. The primary targets were aircraft factories in Leipzig and Tutow, Germany. The bomber stream stretched for miles: B-17s and B-24s in tight defensive boxes, each formation bristling with 50 caliber machine guns, and surrounding them, above them, ranging ahead and behind, were P-51 Mustangs. Major General William Kepner, commander of 8 Fighter Command, had issued new orders for this mission: destroy the enemy air force wherever you find them, in the air, on the ground, and in the factories. The Mustangs weren't just escorts anymore, they were hunters. The Luftwaffe responded with everything they had. Fighter units from across Germany scrambled to intercept the raid. The German pilots expected what always happened: a fierce battle at the German border where they would engage Allied fighters, drive them back due to fuel limitations, then attack the unescorted bombers. But this time, the American fighters didn't turn back. They kept coming. Over Brunswick, Messerschmitt Bf. 109 G6s from Jagdgeschwader 3 rose to intercept. They climbed to 28,000 feet, positioning for diving attacks on the bomber formations. But before they could press their attack runs, Mustangs from the 357th Fighter Group dove on them from above. The German pilots, accustomed to having altitude advantage and the ability to disengage at will, suddenly found themselves fighting for survival. Captain John T. Godfrey, flying with the 4th Fighter Group, described the engagement in his combat report: "We caught them climbing through 20,000 feet. They never expected us to be this far east. We had speed, altitude, and surprise. The fight lasted maybe 10 minutes. I got 109 confirmed, saw 2 others go down smoking. The Krauts scattered. They didn't even try to press their attack on the bombers." This pattern repeated across the entire bomber stream. German fighters would position for attack runs, then find themselves engaged by Mustangs with full fuel tanks and no need to conserve ammunition for the return flight. Luftwaffe pilots, who had grown accustomed to dictating the terms of engagement, attacking when advantageous, disengaging when threatened, now had to fight wherever the Americans found them. And the Mustangs' engines never faltered. Pilots pushed their aircraft through violent combat maneuvers, high G-turns that grayed their vision, rapid climbs that tested the Merlin's supercharger, dives that pushed airspeed indicators into the red zone, and the engines delivered. No overheating, no power loss, no mechanical failures forcing pilots to abort and limp home. In the cockpit, the pilots knew nothing of molybdenum or metallurgy or federal regulations. They knew only that their aircraft worked. When they jammed the throttle forward, the engine responded. That when they needed every ounce of power to catch a fleeing enemy or escape a pursuer, the Mustang gave it to them. What they didn't know was that inside their engines, 16 exhaust valves were cycling open and closed 3,000 times per minute, each cycle exposing the valve to 1,600-degree exhaust gases, and that those valves were maintaining structural integrity because a metallurgist in Cleveland had committed a federal crime. The big week continued for 6 days. Over 3,000 bomber sorties struck German aircraft production facilities. The Luftwaffe launched thousands of defensive sorties, throwing every available fighter into the battle. And the Mustangs were there for all of it, escorting bombers to Leipzig, Regensburg, Augsburg, Stuttgart, Schweinfurt, and back. The statistics from Big Week tell the story. The 8th Air Force lost 226 bombers and 28 fighters. These were significant losses. Over 2,000 American airmen killed, wounded, or captured. But the Luftwaffe lost over 450 fighters destroyed, with an additional 300 damaged. More critically, the Germans lost experienced pilots, men with hundreds of hours of combat experience who could never be replaced. The German training system, already strained by fuel shortages and Allied attacks on training facilities, couldn't produce enough replacement pilots, and the factories were devastated. Bomb damage assessment photos showed destroyed assembly halls, collapsed roof structures, and cratered runways at adjacent airfields. German aircraft production didn't stop entirely dispersed. Manufacturing and underground facilities kept some production going, but output dropped by an estimated 25 to 30% for the next 3 months. More importantly, the Luftwaffe's ability to replace combat losses was permanently degraded. But perhaps the most significant achievement of Big Week wasn't measured in aircraft destroyed or factories damaged. It was psychological. The Luftwaffe discovered they couldn't defend German airspace. American bombers could reach any target, escorted by fighters that could stay with them. German fighter pilots, who had considered themselves masters of the sky, now flew outnumbered and outperformed. The myth of German air superiority was broken, and it was broken, in no small part, by exhaust valves that violated federal law. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By April of 1944, the Mustang's success had created an unexpected problem. Operational tempo was so high that maintenance crews couldn't keep pace. Aircraft were flying multiple missions per week, engines were accumulating hours at unprecedented rates, and routine inspections were being deferred because aircraft were needed for combat operations. This was when the truth about Jeffries valves began to emerge. A routine audit by the War Production Board in May 1944 revealed a discrepancy. An inspector at Packard Motor Company, reviewing materials consumption reports, noticed that the documented alloy composition for exhaust valves didn't match the actual materials requisitions from General Electric. The valves were supposed to be tungsten-chromium steel. The materials records showed molybdenum purchases that couldn't be accounted for in approved projects. The inspector filed a report. The report triggered an investigation, and the investigation led directly to General Electric's Carbaloy division in Detroit, and ultimately to Zay Jeffries. The initial response from Washington was predictable. Jeffries was ordered to appear before a War Production Board inquiry. The questions were pointed: had he used molybdenum in exhaust valve production without authorization? Had he falsified materials certificates? Had he knowingly violated federal regulations governing strategic materials allocation? Jeffries' response was direct: yes, yes, and yes. He had used molybdenum. He had falsified documentation. He had violated regulations. And he would do it again, because the alternative was unacceptable. The transcript of his testimony, preserved in National Archives records, is remarkable for its bluntness. When asked why he hadn't waited for proper authorization, Jeffries responded, because proper authorization was never going to come. The War Production Board was looking at spreadsheets. I was looking at engine failure reports. Every week we delayed was another week of pilots dying because their engines failed over enemy territory. I made the decision to act. When pressed about the legal implications, Jeffries was unrepentant. You can prosecute me if you want. But before you do, I suggest you ask the 8th Air Force what would have happened to the strategic bombing campaign if those Mustang engines had been failing at the rate standard valves would have produced. Ask them how many bombers would have been lost without effective fighter escort. Ask them how many more men would be dead. The War Production Board faced a dilemma. Technically, Jeffries had committed serious violations. Falsifying materials certificates was a federal crime. Unauthorized use of strategic materials was a federal crime. Under wartime regulations, these offenses carried severe penalties, including potential imprisonment. But there was the matter of results. Someone in the inquiry had the presence of mind to request operational data from the Army Air Forces. The data was unambiguous. Packard Merlin engines with Jeffries valves were demonstrating exceptional reliability. Engine failure rates were a fraction of projected rates. Valve replacement intervals had been extended from 50 hours to over 250 hours. Aircraft availability rates were higher than any other fighter type in the European theatre. And perhaps most tellingly, when Army Air Forces maintenance officers were asked if they wanted production of the molybdenum steel valves to stop, their response was unanimous: absolutely not. They wanted more of them. The inquiry took an unexpected turn. Instead of prosecution, discussion shifted to retroactive authorization. Could the War Production Board legitimize Jeffries' actions by officially approving molybdenum allocation for aircraft exhaust valves, backdated to cover the period of unauthorized use? The bureaucratic logic was tortured, but the military necessity was clear. The Mustang was winning the air war. Jeffries' valves were essential to the Mustang's reliability. Therefore, Jeffries' actions, while technically illegal, had served the national interest. In June 1944, the War Production Board quietly issued a revised materials allocation directive. Molybdenum was now officially authorized for aircraft engine exhaust valves, subject to specific compositional limits and oversight procedures. The directive was classified, avoiding public attention. Jeffries received a formal reprimand that went into his file and an informal commendation that didn't. No charges were filed. No prosecution was pursued. The paperwork was buried deep in War Production Board archives, where it remained classified until 1968, 23 years after the war ended. For Jeffries, the vindication was both satisfying and frustrating. He had been proven right, but only after being forced to break the law. He had saved lives, but had to commit a crime to do so. The system had eventually caught up with battlefield reality, but only after a scientist risked his career and freedom to force the issue. He never publicly discussed the incident. In his later writings on metallurgy and materials science, He made no mention of the wartime controversy. He continued his work at General Electric, contributing to jet engine development and high-temperature turbine blade alloys. He retired in 1945 and died 20 years later, his wartime rebellion known only to a handful of military historians and materials scientists. But the impact of his work extended far beyond his lifetime. By June 6, 1944 D-Day, the Mustang had achieved something previously thought impossible: air supremacy over Western Europe. When Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, the skies above were eerily quiet. The Luftwaffe, which should have swarmed the invasion fleet with every available aircraft, barely appeared. Of the roughly 12,000 Allied aircraft supporting Operation Overlord, fewer than 100 encountered German fighters on D-Day itself. Why? Because in the months leading up to the invasion, Mustangs had systematically destroyed the Luftwaffe's operational capability. German fighters were destroyed on the ground during strafing attacks. They were shot down in air combat over Germany. They were never built because the factories that should have produced them had been bombed into rubble, and the few aircraft that did take off faced American fighters that could outrun them, outfight them, and outlast them. Luftwaffe fighter pilot Heinz Nock wrote in his diary, "The Americans are everywhere. We cannot take off without being attacked. We cannot land without being strafed. The Mustangs circle our airfields like wolves around a dying animal. There is no escape." The strategic implications were profound. Air supremacy enabled the D-Day landings. It protected the invasion fleet from aerial attack. It allowed ground attack aircraft to operate freely, destroying German armor and artillery. It gave Allied commanders the flexibility to maneuver forces without fear of air attack. The entire Allied ground campaign in Western Europe was predicated on air superiority, and air superiority was achieved largely through the Mustang. And the Mustang's reliability, the foundation of its operational success, depended on valves that a Cleveland metallurgist had created in violation of federal law. The final statistics tell the story. By war's end, the P-51 Mustang had destroyed 4,950 enemy aircraft in aerial combat, more than any other Allied fighter in the European theatre. Mustang pilots claimed an additional 4,131 aircraft destroyed on the ground during strafing attacks. The aircraft's kill-to-loss ratio was approximately 3.8 to 1, remarkable considering these were long-range missions deep into enemy territory where help was unavailable and mechanical failure meant certain capture or death. Over 15,000 P-51 Mustangs were built between 1942 and 1945. Each Packard Merlin engine contained 16 exhaust valves. That's 240,000 valves, every one of them made from Jeffries molybdenum steel alloy. Every one of them, for the first 6 months of production, is technically illegal. The human cost that was avoided is incalculable. How many bomber crews survived because Mustang escorts didn't have to turn back due to mechanical failures? How many fighter pilots made it home because their engines didn't fail over Germany? How many families received telegrams saying "missing in action" instead of "killed in action" because reliable escorts meant lower bomber losses? We can never know the precise numbers, but we know that in the brutal arithmetic of war, reliability matters as much as performance. An aircraft that's 10% faster but 20% less reliable will lose more pilots. An engine that produces more power but fails more frequently will kill more men. Jeffries understood this. The War Production Board didn't, until battlefield results forced them to acknowledge reality. The story of the Mustang's molybdenum valves reveals something uncomfortable about how wars are won. We prefer narratives of heroic pilots and brilliant generals, of tactical innovation and strategic vision. We're less comfortable acknowledging that sometimes victory depends on bureaucratic defiance, on scientists who trust their expertise over official regulations, on quiet acts of rebellion by men in laboratories who never fired a shot but changed the outcome of battles they would never see. Jeffries never received public recognition. There were no parades, no medals, no newspaper headlines celebrating the metallurgist who made the Mustang reliable. His wartime contribution remained classified for decades. When military historians wrote about the P-51's development, they focused on aerodynamics and engine performance, rarely mentioning the materials science that made sustained high-altitude operations possible. But the pilots knew. Perhaps not the specific details, not the chemistry or the federal regulations or the personal risk Jeffries took, but they knew their engines worked when they needed them. They knew that when they pushed the throttle forward over Germany, 400 miles from the nearest friendly airfield, the engine responded. And they knew that reliability, boring, unglamorous, taken for granted reliability, was the difference between life and death. Captain Donald Blakesley, who commanded the 4th Fighter Group and flew more combat missions than almost any other American pilot in Europe, said in a post-war interview, "The Mustang was fast, sure. It had range, no question. But what made it deadly was that it worked. Day after day, mission after mission, the damn thing just worked. You could count on it. And in combat, when everything else is chaos and terror and luck, having one thing you can absolutely count on, that's everything." What Blakesley didn't know was that the thing he counted on, that Merlin engine that started every time, that maintained power through combat maneuvers, that brought him home from over 100 missions, contained components that violated federal law. That a 58-year-old metallurgist had risked his career, his reputation, and potentially his freedom to ensure that engine would work when Blakesley needed it most. The broader truth extends beyond World War II, beyond aviation, beyond metallurgy. Complex systems, whether military operations or technological development, require specialized expertise that bureaucracies can't always accommodate. Regulations designed to impose order and efficiency can inadvertently prevent the innovations that would serve the very goals those regulations were meant to achieve. The War Production Board's molybdenum allocation made perfect sense on paper. Armor for tanks was clearly more important than engine components for fighter planes. The allocation spreadsheet said so. But spreadsheets can't capture cascading effects. They can't model how a small improvement in engine reliability enables long-range escort missions, which enable strategic bombing, which destroys aircraft factories, which cripples enemy fighter production, which enables air supremacy, which makes amphibious invasions possible. Jeffries saw the cascade, the bureaucrats saw the spreadsheet, and when the two perspectives conflicted, Jeffries chose to trust his expertise and accept the consequences. This pattern repeats throughout military history. The innovative weapons designer who violates procurement regulations to test unauthorized modifications. The field commander who disobeys orders because battlefield conditions don't match headquarters assumptions. The intelligence analyst who breaks classification protocols to share critical information with allies. Sometimes, the rules designed to win wars actually prevent victory, and sometimes, winning requires people willing to break those rules. This doesn't justify wholesale disregard for regulations. Jeffries wasn't acting out of personal ambition or reckless disregard for authority. He was acting from technical expertise and moral conviction. He knew the regulations were wrong because he understood the metallurgy better than the regulators. He accepted personal risk because he believed lives were at stake. And he was proven right, not immediately, not easily, but eventually and conclusively. The tragedy is that it required law-breaking to achieve the outcome. A more responsive bureaucracy, one that listened to technical experts and adapted quickly to operational feedback, could have authorized molybdenum use in early 1943, sparing Jeffries the legal jeopardy and accelerating the Mustang's impact. But bureaucracies don't work that way. They prioritize process over results, compliance over innovation, risk avoidance over mission accomplishment. And so, sometimes, winning requires rebels, scientists who falsify paperwork, engineers who violate specifications, individuals who trust their judgment over institutional authority and accept that history might vindicate them only after they're gone. Zay Jeffries was that kind of rebel, a quiet rebel, a rebel in wire-rimmed glasses who spent his days studying metal alloys and his evenings worrying about pilots he would never meet. A rebel who broke the law to save lives and never asked for recognition. High above Germany in 1944, pilots like Donald Blakesley pushed their throttles forward and felt their Merlin engines respond with mechanical perfection. They climbed to altitude, engaged enemy fighters, pursued fleeing targets, and returned home mission after mission. They trusted their aircraft with absolute confidence because that aircraft had earned their trust through flawless performance. They never knew that performance was illegal, that every valve in their engines was contraband, that a metallurgist in Cleveland had committed federal crimes to give them the reliability they counted on. They just knew their Mustangs worked, and that was enough. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.